To all my hustlers, dreamers, love dealers, I'm that kind of girl. Work hard, play hard, for my own heart, might just rule the world. I'm on fire, can you feel the heat? You can try to, but you can't stop me.
This is Marci Burrows and Carol O'Savin hosting the Midlife Mavens podcast, where we chat candidly about sex, love, relationships, and life for women in their 30s, 40s, 50s, 60s, and beyond. We're both psychologists who specialize in relationships and sexuality, but this isn't therapy. Thanks for joining us to discuss the ups and downs of life in the middle. We hope our conversations inspire and empower you.
A quick disclaimer. We're both psychologists who specialize in relationships and sexuality, but this isn't therapy. This podcast is for educational purposes only and is not a substitute for professional services from a psychologist or other qualified mental health professional. The use of any products or services purchased by you as a result of this podcast does not create a healthcare provider-patient relationship between you and any of the experts affiliated with this podcast. Let's get into today's episode.
Episode today is going to be about who we are and what our podcast is going to look like and why we're doing what we're doing. So I'm Marci Burrows, and I am a psychologist and an ASEX certified sex therapist, and I grew up in a combination of New York and South Florida, and decided pretty early on in college that I wanted to be a psychologist. I had a great professor, teacher in high school who just made psychology a lot of fun. And so I had an interest in taking more psych classes and went to my own therapy in college to work on some trauma stuff from being a kid. And so really just fell in love with psychology and ended up going to the University of Southern Mississippi to do my master's and my PhD. And then I went to University of Tennessee's Counseling Center, where I then continued my career as a staff psychologist there. That's how I met Carol. I think she'll probably tell you more about that. But I worked at the Counseling Center for about 15 years and took some time off to focus on my kids for a while, and then started my private practice about 5 years ago. So decided that I wanted to focus on sex therapy in my private practice because it seemed like there weren't enough people who were good resources for people that were struggling with sex issues in their relationships, and also for people who identified as ethically non-monogamous or LGBTQ plus populations, kink populations, for them to work with people that really understood them within their context and was able to be open and allied and affirming. And so I really wanted to fill that niche. And so I went through a process of getting certified as an ASEX certified sex therapist and started focusing mainly on couples work with mismatched libidos. I also am ADHD, and so struggled with being undiagnosed for much of my childhood, and have really been integrating that into how I view myself and how I do my own work on myself. And I'm really interested in how that impacts relationships and sex. And so I have a neurodivergent affirming practice, and I'm continuing to kind of grow in that clinical interest right now. So that's pretty much who I am, and I'll let Carol introduce herself.
I feel like you're just so much more than what you just described, but I don't know how we would talk about that. So we'll think about that later. This is Carol. I grew up in a small Midwestern community where everybody knew everybody's dirty laundry, basically. And I felt like there were no safe places. If you weren't part of the cool crowd, you just weren't accepted. And so I was desperate to get out. And thankfully, I did well academically, and so that was my way to get out. My parents, who did no higher education, didn't really understand what that was about. And so they said, you can choose. After high school, you can get a job and work and pay rent, You can go into the military. They were both from the military, or you can go to college and we'll help you to the extent that we can. And so thankfully, I was academically talented enough that I was able to use that to get out. So I did. I got my bachelor's and my master's and my PhD all in psychology, in part because I really wanted a title. Somehow I thought that the respectability that I never had as a kid, I would get that if I got that title. And I knew I did not do well in biology or chemistry. So I knew medical school wasn't a route. And then senior year in high school, we had to take a psychology class. It's a requirement in Indiana. And I sort of fell in love and I was like, oh, I could do this. I could do this. So I went to college, majored, fell in love, and that was kind of all she wrote. I'm one of the few people I know who got a bachelor's, a master's, and a PhD in the same field that they then worked in for their career, which is pretty unusual. Really? You too? Okay, there you go. So I went right from graduate school to college and university counseling. That's where Marci and I met. We were both working. She was at the University of Tennessee. I was at Appalachian State University. We were in a professional organization together and we got to know each other and become friends there. And then about 7 years ago, I left the university that I was working at and decided to start my practice. Is that about when you started yours, Marci, or was it a couple years after that?
I'm a couple years after you.
Okay. So then Marci sort of followed a similar path, left agency work and started her own practice. I facilitate a consultation group of professionals, and Marci and I reconnected there and then have been consulting a lot on clients. So because Marci sees couples, as I primarily work with individuals, I center my practice around individuals who really want to change some long-standing patterns that have been problematic in their life. So they've tried things on their own. Maybe they were successful in the past, but are facing struggles that are stumping them a little bit, and they're struggling to figure out how to change things moving forward. Often those struggles are around relationships. And when it seems appropriate, I refer my individual clients to consider couples therapy with their partner. And Marci is one of the people that I use for that. So we've reconnected over several clients that we've shared, and that's been kind of fun. And in one of those conversations, Marci said to me, I have this idea. You want to talk about what your idea was?
Sure. Yeah. So I had been listening to some podcasts just about sex therapy and different things. And I thought, all of these are really geared towards people that are in their like 20s and 30s. And it didn't feel like it resonated that well with me being in my 50s. And I thought, I think we need to have a podcast where women have a space to talk about what it's like to be in your 50s and deal with everything we're dealing with in relationships, with families, with kids. It just seemed like something that wasn't out there that I think personally I would benefit a lot from, and I would hope that other people that are listening would benefit from as well. And I thought Carol would be, first of all, fun to do that with.
Yeah.
She's awesome. But I also thought that we have different life experiences, and so we would have different perspectives to bring to the conversations, and that it would be really awesome to work on all that together. And also I get to meet with Carol almost weekly, which is great. And ironically, like this might have been what you were about to say, but a lot of the things that we're going to talk about in the podcast have gotten in the way of us getting the podcast done earlier.
Yeah.
Life is hard sometimes.
Yep, that's exactly what I was going to say, that some of the issues that we've identified as issues that need to be addressed have presented themselves for either one or the other or both of us, that have taken us away from being able to move forward as quickly as we would like with the podcast. So Marci and I have generated some ideas, tried to put our thoughts together about why we think this podcast is important. And we want to have a place where we want people to know that there is a space in the world where they can talk about stuff that, especially at our age, we didn't grow up knowing it was safe to talk about. If I talked to you about my coming out journey, it would be very convoluted because it wasn't a safe thing to do.
Right.
So that's one of the things that's important to us, is creating a place where at least you and I can talk about these things, and maybe bring in others who can also talk about these things that because of our age, we don't historically feel like there's good places for us to talk about those things with others, and not fear that we'll be judged or criticized. I mean, we could be, right? Like somebody could just not listen to the podcast, but the people that will be involved and that hopefully will stay engaged in the podcast won't be those people that are judging or criticizing us or challenging some of the stuff that's out there right now.
Yeah.
So, yeah.
I think also applying it to women that are in their 40s, 50s, 60s is a different look at it as well. Because there's just not a lot out there about our age group. Even I've been watching some stuff online. I don't know if you've seen, like, Halle Berry's doing a bunch of stuff about menopausal women and the lack of like information out there about women as we go through menopause, which is almost 50% of our lives, going like through perimenopause all the way if we live the full life expectancy.
Right.
But there's not even any medical research or the ability to go. There's not a lot of medical research or the ability to go to doctors who are really knowledgeable and comfortable talking about, well, yeah, that's menopause and this is what happens during that, and celebrating that versus feeling like, oh no, we're getting old, we can't talk about it because we're getting old.
Or a place you can go to get the available treatments to support you through perimenopause, premenopause, menopause. That's what I'm hearing from, I'm way post-menopausal at this point, but that's what I'm hearing from a lot of my friends that are entering that phase, that perimenopause, premenopause, menopause phase. Their doctors are like, oh no, I can't do that. I'm not going to do that. I'm not going to give you hormones or testosterone or support to deal with this kind of stuff, because they don't know enough about how menopause affects people, right? Even female doctors.
Right. Oh, I have my female doctor, she told me that I should be weaning off of my hormones. And really now they're saying that you can be on them for the rest of your life because it works. It makes you feel better. And the risk of cancer isn't higher. And the research is so different, but I still hear from her that I should be weaning off. And she's wonderful in so many ways and very open, but that's just not information that I think she has.
Right. So a place where we maybe can offer, and we're not medical professionals, so we're not going to offer medical advice, but we can certainly offer our own medical experience with people who have taken a different approach. It was my female identified physician who said higher risk in my family. And I was worried about going on hormones because of that. And she was like, oh, but there are different avenues through which hormones can be delivered that reduce your risk of getting breast cancer. I had no idea. So grateful that there are physicians out there who will help with that.
Yeah. Yeah. And I think a lot of times women are told that they're just anxious or they're depressed, and but really it's menopause and it's normal. And, and having a space where we could talk about those experiences, and when is it depression? When is it something out? When do you push and advocate for yourself because you're not feeling heard?
And that sort of merges into another reason why we think this podcast can be helpful for folks. And that is because it goes back to that idea of a safe space, but it's a slightly different reason we need it, which is talking about those issues that we all deal with in our lives that maybe aren't generally accepted as appropriate. So I'm talking about things like when there's conflict in your family of origin and how that plays out as you get older, as your parents get older, if that conflict hasn't been resolved. Things around money and legacy and those kinds of issues. I just was reading some stuff last night about some complicated family dynamics that get involved in how money gets passed on or doesn't get passed on, and how we're supposed to feel or not about that. Does that make sense? What the piece that I'm talking about in terms of having a place to talk about, like, what if you don't get along with your family of origin and you don't want to support them as they age? Right. People worry. I hear a lot. I supported a client whose mother was actively dying, who had to choose how to take care of herself in that environment with the person who was incredibly toxic to her whole life. And everybody was telling her she had to do the right thing, and family is more important than anything.
It's your mother, and you're supposed to support your mother.
Right. And that was not the circumstance that she was being raised in. And that was really difficult for her to feel like she had to be criticized by everybody else who was saying, you should. It's your mother. You should do that.
Right. Yeah. Yeah. So having a space where you can talk about the stuff that we don't feel like we are supposed to talk about, or that we can talk about. And
yeah, your specialty, given that you're a sex therapist.
Absolutely. Yeah. It's one of the first things that I have to deal with a lot of clients is, how do we just talk about sex? Because there's been so many messages that you don't talk about sex. It's not okay to talk about.
Does that kind of hit all the things, all the reasons that we really wanted to do this and have a way to reach out to women who are more our age instead of younger?
I think it covers most of what we had identified.
Okay.
We wanted to just briefly interrupt the episode today to make sure that you all have our contact information. If any of the content that we've talked about in any of our episodes brings up issues that you would like to explore with a psychologist, we want to remind you that Marci and I are both psychologists and would be happy to consider working with you if it seemed like it would be helpful. So a quick blurb about each of our practices.
So my practice focuses mainly on work with couples and individuals around issues related to relationships and intimacy. I'm an ASEC certified sex therapist and work with things like communication skills, life transitions within couples, issues related to intimacy, mismatched libidos, any type of sexual problems in the relationship. I work with issues related to trauma and how that impacts relationships. And I practice from a neurodivergent affirming lens.
And this is Carol. And I would describe my practice as one directed exclusively toward individuals who feel like they are struggling to change some long-standing patterns in their lives. So you might think of those as core issues that have been present in their lives for a long time that are no longer serving them in the way that they did previously. So I can help individuals figure out what those core issues are, figure out ways of dealing with them a little bit differently so that they don't encounter the same kind of obstacles in their lives.
I also work with a lot of individuals who identify as LGBTQ and with women who are encountering difficulty in their relationships with their moms as they age, or older moms who are having difficult relationships with their adult daughters.
If you're interested in working with either one of us, we both offer 15-minute consultations to assess if it seems like would be a good fit for your therapeutic needs. You can go to my website, which is Marci, Marci Burroughs, Burroughs, PhD, CST.com, or Carol's website, which is drosabin.com, DROSABEN.com. We also have our websites in the YouTube channel notes for this episode. And now back to our episode. Do we want to talk a little bit more about
what it'll look like?
Yeah, what it'll look like.
You want to start with that?
Yeah, so we're thinking we'll do approximately 30-minute episodes. And maybe if some news topic or major thing happens in the world that seems to be applicable, we might do some little short mini pieces as well. But for the most part, we'll do about 30 minutes of mostly us talking. Maybe eventually we'll bring in some other people.
Yeah.
But,
and Marci has created a Facebook page for Midlife Mavens for the podcast that hopefully once we get some podcast episodes out and get some listener engagement, we can also get folks onto the Facebook page and we can take questions or concerns from listeners and address those. And we have a whole list of topics for podcasts, but we're happy to take other ideas from listeners that might be helpful for them to talk about in a podcast. And I think we also talked about maybe bringing in experts even about things. I mentioned I do this consultation group for other therapists that you're a part of, and somebody on there works a lot with cognitive decline as some of her patients age. And so I thought, oh, that would be good, because a lot of us, as we deal with our aging parents, are dealing with cognitive decline and how that affects the relationship and care and all of that. So we might do that, invite some folks in who have more knowledge about specific topics than we do.
Yeah, that sounds great. And we also would love to get questions for the topics that we do that you'd want to have us talk about, or might not have an answer, but we certainly can brainstorm and throw around our thoughts and our opinions on things.
Right. And we're really good at identifying resources too, so we can do that. Like, maybe not have the answers, but we know where to look for them. Yeah. And I think we talked about, and again, this will be a life dependent issue, I think, given what we've experienced over the last year, but we talked about maybe trying to get one out every other week, I think. Was that it? Or once a month? Okay.
Yeah.
So to get sort of a flow going with some of the things that we'll talk about. And then, like Marci said, maybe some Maven minis, if we come up with something that we feel like can be addressed in a brief, shorter, kind of a bite-sized podcast episode, we'll do that.
What about some of the topic ideas, just kind of in general?
Yeah, sure.
So we already mentioned internalized patriarchy, but that's one of the things that we identified that we'd want to talk about.
Yeah. And we've mentioned aging parents and how do we navigate that. So many pieces of the aging parent, the cognitive piece, end of life kind of struggles and issues, but also navigating that when you still have younger kids, right? When you have your own life that you're trying to navigate, when job and career issues, how do those collude with, crash into with our issues of trying to provide care for aging parents or something like that. So all of that sort of, what do they call when you have young children and parents? You're kind of the Oreo generation. You're in that Oreo phase of your life where you're trying to deal with your parents and your kids. Women our age, children are probably a little bit older, and so it might not be the same kind of struggle as having young children, but having other things that have us engaged in our lives. And then how do we navigate that when we might have extended family members or family of origin members that need support as well?
Yeah, I mean, I think even with that, just kind of getting to this phase in life, like for me, I'm just at a place where I don't have the responsibility of my kids, and then dealing with aging parents. For some people, you finally get this freedom of having maybe a little bit more financial freedom and freedom from responsibility of parenthood, but then all of a sudden there's the demands of taking care of elderly parents.
Right. And then that goes back to that issue of, are you obligated to do that? Especially when it comes to financial stuff. So lots of issues around the aging parent topic.
And around like kids growing up and the whole empty nest. And what do you do with your empty nest? And how's that different if you're still with your partner from who you had your kids with, or if you're with a different partner, or if you're single? Like there's so many different ways that can look for different women in this age group and stage of life. And
and it brings up issues if you're not currently partnered. It brings up issues of dating and how do you date and how do you find people to date and all of those. How do you deal with that with your children as they're getting older, or with your ex if there's an ex involved, and those kinds of issues.
Things listed related to relationships and dating. Being a sex therapist, that's sort of where some of my interests lie. And so, what does sex look like in your 50s, 60s, 70s, 80s? Like what, a lot of people assume you stop at some point, but it doesn't have to be that way. So kind of having conversations about that, how libido changes as you age and how that's different across different people, and not
Yeah.
all women in our age group experience that the same way.
And along with that, like we talked already about some of the menopause kinds of issues that we want to make sure that we are able to address, but other kinds of health concerns that we face as we get older and having to navigate those kind of crises if they're a crisis of sorts, but how to get support when you're dealing with some of those issues, whatever health related concerns you might have. Does that touch on the gamut of things?
It does. I think we kind of hit most main areas.
Yeah.
Okay.
And again, like we said, happy to take questions from folks about a specific issue that might be of interest that we haven't thought about. And certainly there's lots of subcategories of the things that we've mentioned that we'll be addressing as well. So anything else? Yeah, that you want to touch on, Marci, in our laying it all out there kind of episode?
I think we've covered most of it. Just
Okay.
I'm excited to be getting started.
Yeah, it has been a long, technologically challenging process to be able to get to the point.
We could do a technology in your 40s, 50s
Yes,
episode.
we could, especially if you don't have children who are more technologically native and can solve it for you, which is my issue. Okay. So I think that wraps it up then. Well, I'll look for our next episode coming out in the next couple of weeks.
Yeah, thanks for joining us.
Thanks for being with us and helping us get this thing off the ground. And thank you, Marci, really, for inviting me to be a part of this. I might have thought about the idea, but I don't think I would have ever done anything with it. So I really appreciate you.
My pleasure. I'm excited to be working on a project with you again.
Yeah, I think it'll be fun. All right. All right. See y'all next time.
This has been Marci Burrows and Carol O'Sabin with the Midlife Mavens podcast. As psychologists, we are big advocates for therapy. If anything in today's conversation left you feeling like there is more that you would like to explore, we encourage you to pursue therapy. In today's episode notes, we've listed links for several directories you could use to find a therapist who's a good fit for you. Thanks for joining us today. We look forward to seeing you in a future episode. Be sure to visit our Midlife Mavens Facebook page to share your ideas about future conversations.